Thanks very much for coming out. Thanks for having me. I appreciate everybody being here. Well, here goes. The American empire must be stopped. We must stop it before it's too late. And really, there's just no question about how bad things could get. You look back the entire history of mankind, all empires fall. And where there's great power, there's great arrogance in dealing out that power. And then, it's just like the story of Icarus. He flies too close to the sun, his wings melt, and he falls crash into the sea. It's happened over and over again throughout human history. And this is the same course that we're pushing now, is empire. Really, it's murder-suicide writ large is what it is. And it is serving right now as the number one destructor of what is good in our society, our liberty and our prosperity. War in America is almost always framed in terms of fighting for freedom. And now how could anyone oppose fighting for freedom? And yet, James Madison, who was the fourth president of the United States, the principal author of the Constitution and the author of the Bill of Rights, wrote in 1795 that, and this is the whole quote without the ... of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. In War II, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied. And all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. The same malignant aspect in republicanism may be traced in the inequality of fortunes and the opportunities of fraud growing out of a state of war, and in the degeneracy of manners and morals engendered by both. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. Now, I read that, and it sounds like our current day politicians have just taken him up on the challenge to see if they can do it, prove every one of these words right if they can, and they seem to be doing a really good job at it. I think you'll note, perhaps in that statement, that James Madison was assuming victory, right? Nowhere in here does he say, we're threatened if we get into a war and we're defeated and taken over by some foreign power. He's assuming in this case that we're winning, or we would win, but it's even in victory that we end up growing the central state and its power and dominion over our society. And now I guess it could be possible to have a war for freedom. Like, did anybody see the movie Battle LA? Where the aliens come from space for no good reason whatsoever, just to kill us all and take our stuff? Or like, if it was 21-25 and say, I don't know, the EU, South American, Libyan axis of evil got their armada to come and invade South Carolina and drop millions of paratroopers on our cities like in Red Dawn, something like that, I can see that. But this isn't that. This is the era of the phony wars. This is the era of the American empire. And because we have no enemies left in the world, there are no powers on earth that challenge us. In South America, the biggest power is Brazil. They're our friend. They sell us beef. In Africa, there's no power whatsoever. Europe, every single one of them are our friends. We get along now with the Russians, with the Chinese, with the Indians. America has no enemies, except for a small band of stateless killers. And the small band of stateless killers wouldn't even exist, but for the American occupation of the Middle East and our world empire. Now, if you're like me, you're subject all day long, and you have been for 10 years straight, to a relentless stream of propaganda about the evil of Islam and how the only reason we were attacked on September 11th, you all saw it, those planes came out of the clear blue sky. The only explanation is that we're good. And the people who attacked us did it because they hate goodness. And the explanation for their hatred of goodness is their Islamic extremism. And you see, there's apparently this sliding scale, and once your Islam gets a certain amount of extreme, then you decide you hate good things, and you try to kill those things. And this argument has won. And the argument that I'm about to make to you today is still the Minority Report. You can hear it from Dr. Ron Paul and a couple of other places, on the national stage, but very rarely do you hear anyone say that America picked this fight. America occupied Saudi Arabia beginning in August of 1990, and they never left. And when bin Laden declared war on the United States in 1996, he said, the reason we're doing this is because you're occupying the holy land of Mecca and Medina. He didn't say you have oil businessmen from Texas going there and shaking hands, and that's why we're fighting you. He said you have combat forces, Army and Air Force occupying our holy land. And why were they there? They were there to blockade and ritually bomb Iraq for 12 years straight. The Gulf War, the first Gulf War, never really ended to this day. We've been bombing Iraq for 20 years at this point. And it was the occupation of Saudi Arabia in order to blockade and bomb Iraq in the 1990s that engendered al-Qaeda terrorism against the United States. And the strategy is clear. They were trying to bait us. It's sort of like America is the biggest bully in the neighborhood, and he can beat up anybody one-on-one. And their strategy is the asymmetric strategy. They come and punch us in the mouth hard enough to trick us into chasing them into their part of the neighborhood where all their friends are waiting with baseball bats. And then, we get what's coming to us, in a sense. And so, and this is no longer a matter of speculation or interpretation. In fact, Osama bin Laden's son, who disapproves, one of his sons who very much disapproves of this strategy and tactics, gave an interview to Rolling Stone last summer where he said, my father's dream was to trick the United States into invading Afghanistan so we could replicate the war from the 1980s, when the CIA backed the terrorists because they were our friends, for the exact same reason. Why did we do it? To bleed the Soviet Empire to death, to break their back on the mountains of Afghanistan. And Osama bin Laden took the message from that. All we need to do is, we need AK-47s and faith in Allah, and we can bring down the world's greatest empires. We already did it, watch us do it again. And that's why they bombed the African embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya in 1998. And that's why they bombed the USS Cole in the year 2000. It's not because they thought we would turn tail and run. It's because they were trying to get us to invade the Middle East with hundreds of thousands of troops and waste all our money, bankrupt our country, so that then the empire broken would finally be forced out altogether. And they said so. A lot of people, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about how Osama bin Laden really works for the CIA and that kind of thing. And I say you could turn the whole thing around and say that really, if you want a conspiracy theory that makes sense, how about Dick Cheney and the neoconservative movement work for Osama bin Laden and are all on the payroll of the Saudis? Because what they did was they fell for it. They fell for it. Now, Dick Cheney and the neoconservatives had written Rebuilding America's Defenses and all of their plans for how to create what they call permanent global hegemony. That's a nice American euphemism for world empire for you there. And when September 11th happened, they took the opportunity to expand and to, they thought, make their empire permanent. But really all they did was sow the seeds of their own destruction. And we can see Osama bin Laden's goals being fulfilled. In fact, the great military writer and humorist Jeff Huber just wrote a piece last week called Osama bin Laden, Dead and Loving It. And it was about how no one in the history of the world has ever been as successful as this guy, militarily. All he was trying to do was bait us into messing our own selves up, and he got us traipsing all over the entire Middle East. carrying out his will. In fact, in his speech of 2004 that came out right before the election to try to scare you into re-electing George Bush, because George Bush served his purposes perfectly, he said, listen, all I have to do is take a piece of cloth upon which it is written Al-Qaeda, and I'll send 2 mujahideen to the furthest point east, and you'll send all your generals and all your billions of dollars racing until finally your empire is bankrupt and you'll get up and go home. They didn't really explain that part on TV. They just said, Osama bin Laden, vote Republican. Kind of left out the details of why Osama wanted people to vote Republican, because he figured that was the quickest way to bankrupt the empire. He hadn't anticipated Barack Obama, I guess. Here's the thing. The other thing that Osama bin Laden wanted to accomplish, other than bankrupting our empire, was radicalizing the Middle East. Of course, he wanted him or someone like him to end up ruling some caliphate, overthrowing all the local dictators after driving us out. And what we're seeing here is how he got that one about half right. He certainly succeeded in bankrupting our empire, and it's our empire's bankruptcy, more than anything, on top of the 10 years of war in the region, that have radicalized the people of the Middle East and are now rising up and overthrowing, or at least attempting to overthrow, their American-backed dictators. And if you read the financial press, they'll tell you it was the price inflation. As Ben Bernanke and the Federal Reserve turn on the money machine in order to pay for the American government's debts, all the other governments in the world have to increase their money supplies as well in order to keep their balance of trade right. And so now you have people across the old world who live on $2 a day, and their $2 is now worth 75 cents. And they can't put food on their family, and so they go out into the street and start a fight. And they're winning. In fact, I think the Egyptians are nullifying the American empire as we speak. But now the people of the Middle East rising up from Morocco to Pakistan, they're not pushing for an Osama bin Laden style, let's get back to true Wahhabism, reactionary sort of ideology whatsoever. What are they pushing for? You see it even on TV, they can't deny it. They're pushing for an end to dictatorship. They're pushing for a modicum of a rule of law, maybe some fair trials instead of having their confession tortured out of them anytime they happen to get arrested. And they want basic economic freedom. This is not Osama bin Laden's revolution, but it is certainly one that is forcing the empire out. So far he's got us 1.5 to 0. And then the third major goal that Osama bin Laden stated all along was, and this phrase comes from right after September 11th, he said the American people will be smothered and will live a choking life. And he goes on to talk about the police state that we will create for ourselves in the name of protecting ourselves from him. And how eventually, just like with the overreaction they were trying to get with the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, etc., they're trying to get a reaction from our state too. Probably, a third of the people are here tonight are here because a TSA agent or some anti-terrorist cop with a machine gun at a subway somewhere or something, went over the line too far. This national security state, the clampdown reaction to September 11th makes us hate our own state, and then hopefully, and it just happens to be the right thing anyway, we will use that pressure to force an end to the empire that we shouldn't be doing in the first place. Right. And so people complain about the Patriot Act. I think it's been so long we forget what it even means anymore. But what it means is cops can write themselves a warrant to search your house, not some terrorist's house, your house. It means that the Fourth Amendment is gone. And we've had so much torture and so much secrecy and so many lies. The Patriot Act is old hat, right? That might as well have been Bill Clinton's Counterterrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. Who's calling for the repeal of that one lately, right? Who remembers that overstretch? It's all old news. And the Patriot Act itself, just renewed last week in the name of the terror war, it really fits as a symbol for the rest of it, for the torture, for the signing statements, for the state secrets privilege being invoked to keep any case about spying or torture out of court, away from any accountability. And as we saw with the reauthorization of the very worst parts of the Patriot Act for another 4 years, just, yesterday, or the day before yesterday, it is almost impossible to roll back, really any of this ever, but especially it's hard to do it in wartime. I don't think any of us could conceive of a Congress that would go ahead and let the Patriot Act lapse as long as we're at war. In fact, when Rand Paul said, let's just wait 3 days and have a little debate on the Senate floor, Harry Reid said, you're trying to get us attacked by Al-Qaeda terrorists. That's the Democratic majority leader of the Senate, paraphrasing Karl Rove for you, right? Anyone who opposes our power is trying to get us killed by the terrorists. And as long as we're at war, that's not going to change. So this is the civil rights movement of our era, is ending the war. You know, they kill 1 million Iraqis. They've killed tens of thousands of Pakistanis. They turned Somalia and Yemen completely upside down and killed tens of thousands more. Certainly in Somalia, tens of thousands more have been killed in that unknown war. And we're all suffering like a bunch of Fallujahs ourselves. In fact, on the way here, my girlfriend had to get her palms scanned for explosives residue at the airport. And you know, it could have been worse. That's not going to change until we end the empire. But here's how we can end the empire. We just nullify it. We just refuse to go along with it. You actually called Thomas E. Woods earlier in order to clarify. Yes, offensive war is perfectly, that is aggressive criminal war, is perfectly constitutional as long as you have a declaration of war. I say, who cares about a declaration of war? They declare war on the Russians and get us into a thermonuclear exchange that kills all human life. Are we going to debate about whether it was declared or not? You know, who started it? If they murder 1 million Iraqi civilians in an aggressive war of occupation, does it matter if they declared war or not? Well, I'll tell you what, in 1812 through 14, the fact that the Congress constitutionally declared war against England didn't matter at all to the northern states. You know, we know the War of 1812 is just another one of those wars where we thought it must have been necessary, but at the time, half the country was against it. Half the country called it Mr. Madison's War. You know, the guy that warned us about the total state that we'll get if we let him wage wars all the time, which was, 20 years before he started this one. Not quite. And the Yankees said, nah, you're just trying to aggressively invade and steal Canada and conquer Canada, and we're not going to go along. They refused to call up their troops. They refused to participate in the war effort whatsoever, constitutional or not. Who wants to invade Canada? That's evil, man. You don't do that. That's what the Nazis did, invaded people. We're not like them. And, you know, and we weren't supposed to be anyway. And so it shouldn't matter whether any particular war is constitutional, only whether it's moral or not. And then if we can find a way as people to take responsibility and nullify that war, then we need to do everything we can to do so. And so if that means local counter-recruitment efforts at your high school and in your shopping malls, where the kid comes out of the recruiter's office and you're waiting there with a fistful of truth about what it's really like to be in the service, or whether you're in the high schools arguing with the soldiers who come and lie to these kids. I mean, how many times did you hear people say, yeah, when I was recruited, they told me that now that Obama's president, all the wars are going to end, so I can go ahead and sign up and it'll be safe, and it'll pay for my college, and so all that's over now. And also, you know, there's very few examples of this. The most important example is Representative Aaron Libby in the state of Maine, who's in their state House of Representatives, and he's got a bill, I think 1309, to make it a crime, or to make it, I guess, official policy of the state of Maine that the national government, they will not cooperate with any national government call on their National Guard forces without a congressional declaration of war, or unless an immediate invasion needs repelling, which is ridiculous. So that's a good start. I mean, I don't think we can rely on our state governments, but I'll tell you this, you guys have a lot better chance of making yourself a state representative or making one of your friends a state representative than you do having a chance at getting to the U.S. Congress, right, Dennis? And so, well, he was running against a warmonger in San Francisco, and they love war in San Francisco, as long as it's being waged by the first female Speaker of the House and her president. Anyway, but so, this is where change actually can be made. You can actually never even mind running for office. You can get to know your state representatives, and you can have an influence on how they think and how they vote. It doesn't take too many people to say, we're the residents of East LA for peace or whatever, and we're here to educate you on how you ought to be voting on these issues. And Lord knows there are plenty of military issues in California. And look, it's either this or absolute bankruptcy. Okay? If the war party has their way, they will consume every bit of the so-called social entitlement programs. They will consume every last one of our lives, every last bit of our property if they have to in order to maintain this world empire. They've got 1,000 military bases around the world, and they don't want to give up a single one of them. They have to be made to. And I don't necessarily know the different steps that can be taken as far as making that impact on the local level. But well, there's always that, but then they can always print the money. I mean, I really think what it comes down to is a common understanding in the society. Like nowadays, I think pretty much everyone admits, even the people who were for the Iraq War back then pretty much admit, oops, right, we shouldn't have done that. Bin Laden was hiding out in a house in Pakistan. What the hell are we doing over there in Iraq? We kind of, the zeitgeist has changed or whatever. Right now, we all know better than that dumb Iraq thing we shouldn't have done. Well, maybe now we can move that idea a little bit further forward. Maybe we don't need a world empire at all. Ron Paul told the Washington Post back in 2007, we can defend this country with a couple of good submarines. And when you think about it, he really is right about that, right? We have 2 weak and friendly neighbors to the north and south. We have 2 giant oceans to protect us. The only country that could really defeat us in a war would be the Russians with their hydrogen bombs. And then none of the stuff is any good for stealing because it's all irradiated. So, I mean, we really have a pretty safe country. We really could be protected with a couple of good submarines. We, I think, can really start from the bottom up by changing our understanding of how necessary all this militarism is, and then get to figuring out some solutions to, especially following the example of the state rep in Maine, work from the bottom up to obstruct the empire.
Yeah.
Thank you.